Well, good evening. I have to confess to be feeling, not for the first time as a journalist, very much out of my depth and something of a fraud. It is, I think, that in the condition of being a journalist that we should always feel that way. But we have a panel tonight to discuss accountability in international law, international relations, and human rights across the world. A very, very distinguished panel, only in the order in which they are introduced on the website. I shall introduce them. We've got Philippe here, who's Professor of Laws and Director of the Centre of International Courts and Tribunals at University College London, and a number of other roles and distinctions which he will outline for us. We've got Janine Giovanni, very, very old friend, full disclosure here, of mine, a brilliant writer who took a pretty radical career change and now runs the Reckoning Project in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world in the realm of human rights. I shan't steal any more of her thunder. She can explain exactly what all of that means. And Ibrahim Olabi, who is a barrister who specialises in international law and is also something of an activist in on the Middle East and elsewhere. He's originally from Syria. And again, his personal story is very powerful, but also the areas in which he works are extremely important. And as ever, and we were talking about this earlier on, about how kind of timely perhaps this discussion is. I have been covering wars for, I think, 33 years or so. I can't really remember whether it's the Somali famine and American invasion of Somalia back in 1993, the Rwandan genocide, the fall of Yugoslavia, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. When was it not highly pertinent and timely to be discussing these issues? But in order to start things off and set the cat among the pigeons, one of the issues I have struggled with, and Janine and I, having covered many conflicts together, in fact, have often discussed this, is the extent to which, as journalists, we rely on human rights law, international law, as a kind of template or a framework against which to judge or give energy to pieces that we're writing in a conflict, about a conflict, to a wider audience in order for them to understand why it matters or why it's quote-unquote bad. And then at the same time, the kind of private feeling, which is that war is the end of reason. It is conflicts, particularly civil conflicts, can be deliberately and systematically grotesque, very targeted and malicious in the deliberate use. Indeed, people's what is the point? So and the kind of enforce criminal acts in the international. If I stall, and then I'll start asking some questions, and then later on we'll open it up to the audience. Janine.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out. It's a real pleasure to see this room full, to hear a topic like accountability. So I began my career 33 years ago in Gaza, actually. I was an academic, and my lawyer, Philippe, camps, and West Bank. I basically forever, and my work life changed. And I stayed out. And I knew each breaking war that in the aftermath of it, where justice was not served. So I went on to cover many, many wars in the 33 years. Sam and I, actually, we met in Rwanda in '94 during the genocide. And then we were together in many other wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So basically, listen, incredible. Because how books and these that without justice, there could never be healing. Without transitional justice, you would have war again in 20 or 30 years. So literally, I was phoned by Peter Pomerantsev, who's a British academic and expert on propaganda, and he said, he was born in Kyiv, and he said, what can we do? And I said, well, I just finished a project at the UN in Iraq and Syria, training doctors and first responders to understand what a war crime is so that they could take testimony that could be admissible in court. Because the thing about journalists like Sam and I, we were good reporters, our notebooks were good, but they really called by hate them. Remember. Be only investigative social work. I mean, they're not international. Them in criminal Costin, who we work very closely with. Sorry, I know I'm conscious of time. So what we do, once they're trained, and we have several trainings several times a year, and they become war crime investigators. They're no longer journalists. They are not acting as journalists when they're in the field for us. The minute something happens, testimony, and all kinds of fancy tools that didn't exist in our day. We then archive them, and some of them, most of them, go to Ibrahim, who he has a team of 4 lawyers. They analyze them. A team of 4 lawyers. They analyze them, and they decide which are going to go where. And they decide which are going to go where, to the prosecutor, to a universal jurisdiction case, which he'll talk about, or to other international justice mechanisms like UN special rapporteurs or papers. To influence very different narrative. I think we're talking important too much
and structure but also
It's lovely. Start
structure, but also
and I think it's a legitimate question to ask. But I think it's also worth going back to another era. Go back to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, the rules that Janine did not. Then optimistic. Go. Moment manifest no and was and it's called adopt children. By the game of its way. Works and argued measure change significant reporting and a few extraordinary they want programming of the special now engage ever nevertheless, court to issue individuals and experience. Sites. The emergent concept who could all about theory should not abroad. Visit he goes. English legal historian called John Baker, Sir John Baker, and he would occasionally summon me for lunch and ask me what I was working on, and I'd say, "Oh, I'm doing this or that and the other," and he'd say, and it took, and that's but
Adequate. Wasn't even the United Kingdom back then. But Ibrahim, you face this task both in terms of theory, but also in terms of personal experience and absolute practicality. How does that bear on your life, both working and personal, perhaps?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for such a large audience that I honestly where this one I need to and they often why where he's under national the wherever it's why they some you know push are all engaging one way or the other with the international system. Because I think the same question that Philippe asked you, what is the alternative? They know the alternative is going back to absolute lawlessness. And that, from at least numerical, economic numbers, has severe, severe consequences on the world. So they're trying to kind of hold on to it in whichever way that they can. And our role is to be able to kind of objectively use that as a common language to rally people. Use that as a common language to rally people. The fact that in the core group for the Court of Aggression on Ukraine, there's another 40-odd different language to rally all understands. The law is to the law is to stigmatize us to it able to provide a lot of support to the institute against that people are Court of Justice over the Torture Convention, the Mass Torture Convention, the mass torture in Syria, under again the similar provision. It's not about Dutch nationals, it's not about Canadian nationals, but it's about, for them, how did this Dutch legal advisor convince his minister to take this? I don't know how much Syria or Syrians were on the table, to be perfectly honest. I level the chemical unfortunately do pictures lots of you some of you knowing that at the same time we get texts from media, from journalists, non-responsible journalists unlike yourself, who say Syria, and I quote, "Sorry, Syria is cancelled because of October 7 events." So not like that way, for that reason, we didn't even get the coverage to be able to show the world, but they still knew to show the world, but they still knew, they still came, the victims and the survivors, and they still rallied. They still came, the victims and the survivors, and they still rallied. And that should matter for something. If a mother is willing to look at the picture of her son, do that trip on a bus from God knows where in Europe, hold it outside the International Court of Justice and thank the Netherlands, then that means something, and we must try to hold on to it as much as we can. So
Introduction. review. Maybe getting to is
you. Okay, so
I make chutney.
sorry, no, but all right. So the real challenge for us is the sheer level. We're just working in Ukraine right now, but we will use the methodology which we've refined to go to other places, and especially places where I feel they have been overlooked, like Sudan. It's now so. So they would often just child hospital. And with the behind Philippe and Ibrahim speak to, which is the eradication of this identity of being Ukrainian, which is what, Putin's big thing. There is no Ukraine. There is little Russia. There is no Ukrainian people. And, whether their culture, their language, their history speaks against that, this is what Putin wants. He wants the eradication of these kids. And I just came from Kyiv, where I was at the First Lady's conference on this subject of children, with Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, and with Kostin. And it is a grave crime, because what are children? Children are the future, right? So if you take children out of a country, and 19,000 of them. Now that's the figure we use, but others off the record say it could be as high as 35,000, if not more. So what do? We get testimonies from the people who last saw these kids before they were put on the buses, before they got on the Russian railroads and went to Moscow. Were put on the buses before they got on the Russian railroads and went to Moscow. We had one case of a father who was trying to flee Mariupol with his 3 kids, and he was stopped at a checkpoint. He was taken off to a filtration camp, which is something like a prison where they try to determine if you're working for the Ukraine. Force the number. Where's the boss? kids, and they've come out. And we're now getting kids that are beginning to come back from Russia. That wants to the families are, and so of course deportation of the children. I'll turn over to these
I'd
guys.
like to take your perch. The indictment of Vladimir Putin by the International Criminal Court in an open arrest warrant. I think it was a terrible mistake. And I want to put the other side of the coin now. I am not starry-eyed about international law. I'm not starry-eyed about international criminal law. Criminal methods and means of war. Methods and means of war, crimes against humanity, harms against individuals, genocide. National with the war crime. The aggression. Nothing to do with an issue of principle. I'm sorry, we've got to call a spade a spade. It had no be the creation of powers that be within the prosecutor's office in the International Criminal Court took the view we'd better find a way to get to Putin, to show that we don't need such an institution because we can deal with it. Now, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. Deporting children is a crime under international law. And it's a serious and in the scheme of years, it is not top of my list in terms of all the horrors. My sense is the prosecutor did not get authorization from a pretrial chamber of judges to go for other crimes against humanity or war crimes. That was all they could get Putin for. And the error has been compounded by going for a public happened philosophy images when that was announced. The prosecutor, the president of the International Criminal Court were front and center, portraits, photographs. Why on earth is that going on? Why is that happening? We should be focusing on the substance of these issues. And that on the substance of these issues. And that leads to the second problem. Having publicly indicted in relation you would not know who has been indicted, and frankly, you don't need to know who has been indicted, unless you want to demonstrate that you are acting in the bed. What I'm suggesting is that however much we may wish for an international criminal justice system that is effective and workable, let us also not shirk our responsibility. Now, I think, very unhelpfully. Secret indictments would have been just as effective, that we would not know precisely
He's talking family. They can't travel. And it also sends a strong message, which is what I believe in, which is that perpetrators will be caught.
But they wouldn't travel if you had secret. But they wouldn't travel if you had secret indictments. If the prosecutor simply says, "I've issued 7 indictments," if the prosecutor simply says, "I've issued 7 indictments in relation to this matter. They are sealed. I'm not telling you who they are," I can assure you those people would cut.
Whole conversation structure. Perspectives. I gave up on outcomes. I no longer outcomes in the sense of court indictments in the context of Syria. I don't personally believe them. I still work towards them. And for me, matter. You know, if it's more people have died in previous wars, as you said. Statistically, the numbers are less now. So that numbers don't matter for a grieving mum or dad or parent. So in a way, different people are viewing it. So in a way, different people are viewing it different. Different people are viewing it differently. And so for us at the Reckoning Project, I think a good case to kind of illustrate that is that when we've seen something survive indirect double crimes are geographically kind of triggered, or just you can just filter them by geography, which you can't. They're supposed to be international conventions binding everyone. So the idea is that we wanted to kind of affect that now. And how you become this. He knows that the arrest warrants are going to be hard to get. He knows, but he was happy to bring his pain and suffering thousands of miles away to be able to file that in a case. We decided to report on that case, and we managed to get Reuters to cover it accurately, because I think that's also the issue there. And we managed to get Reuters to cover it accurately, because I think that's also the issue there. A lot of people confuse courts, say arrest warrants. Him, his life, and it person, we're promoting accountability. We're showing that we're not going to give up. And if perpetrators and person, we're promoting accountability. We're showing that we're not going to give up. And if perpetrators, if victims are not giving up, if they're willing to go through so much pain and suffering and re-traumatization, and they're not giving up, then
but I wanted to out with incredible and frankly grotesque abandon by some of my colleagues, and I have personally witnessed the unfolding. I was among the bad guys when they were doing the killing in Rwanda, and that was a very clear case of genocide that the it's going on is the grand crime, if you like, of genocide. Philippe, I wonder if you could speak to that.
I'd be very happy to speak to it, but I just want to come back because I'm so interested by what Ibrahim has said. And of course, I'm completely with you, but beware what you hope for. Because the case that you have described, which I've idea place was arrested. After getting him to be held and detained here in London, not so far from where we are, he returns to Chile on grounds of ill health. And I can tell you, from the people that I've been speaking with, that act of return has been devastating. Devastating. And it's not when it goes is the issue in relation to genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes prosecuted at the international level. I was counsel for Palestine in the case on the right of self-determination before the International Court of Justice recently concluded, ruling that the occupation of the West Bank and of Gaza is manifestly illegal. In the to shoehorn your case into the concept of genocide. Pause for a moment. Many of you will have read East-West Street. You'll know that genocide is in my DNA, in a certain sense. I've also argued most of the cases on genocide at the International Court of Justice, and mostly lost them, because no state has ever been found to be responsible for genocide before the International Court of Justice, because the test the International Court of Justice has applied up at this point establishes so high a threshold that it has never been possible to prove that the only intention that motivates the act is to destroy the group in whole or in part. And in a case where a country exercises the right of self-defense, which Israel has done excessively, in my view, and manifestly in violation of war crimes laws and crimes against humanity laws, the argument will be it was not the only intention. And therefore, in legal terms, it's not characterized as genocide. The horrible reality is that there is, and you've alluded to this, a wide gulf between what regular smart folk consider to be genocide and the, frankly, rather horrible definition of genocide in international law, which makes it impossible to prove. The media, who are really not very attentive to these kinds of things, focus on the prosecutor's indictments in relation to Hamas and in relation to Israel. I have not seen a single article address the fact that the prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan, did not indict for genocide on either side. He knows how difficult it is to prove genocide. Now imagine we now have two courts in The Hague proceeding with these cases. The ICC actually has jurisdiction over genocide. It didn't prosecute or seek an arrest warrant for genocide. What signal does that send to the judges of the International Court of Justice of the claim of genocide? I don't know exactly the answer to the question, but it sends a signal. And if you take the trouble to read, not out of context, as most of the journalists have done, what the International Court of Justice has said in its successive provisional measures orders, and you take the trouble to go on the web and read the separate but concurring opinion, for example, of Judge Nolte, the German judge, it's very easy to find and read it, it's 3 or 4 pages, you will see that there is a fair prospect that at the end of the day, the International Court of Justice will find in relation to Gaza there is no genocide. And that will be devastating. It will be devastating for those who have hitched their wagon to the genocide claim, and they're perfectly entitled to. I'm not in any way criticizing. If South Africa wants to bring a case for genocide, fine. But be aware that proving it is another thing. And if you fail to prove it, you will let a lot of people down, leave a lot of people feeling, what the shit? We spent 5 years litigating this thing, or 15 in the case of Croatia versus Serbia, and we lost because the ICJ ruled in the end that what happened at Vukovar was crimes against humanity, but was not genocide. A decision I think was wrong, but which nevertheless is the decision, and therefore I have to respect. And I can tell you today, in Croatia, people are seriously pissed off that The Bosnians got a genocide for Srebrenica, and they didn't get a genocide. They only got a crime against humanity. So again, the long-term unintended consequences of bandying words around, making claims, arguing cases, running cases, can be absolutely devastating, and they will have their long-term consequences. And that has to be put into the equation, I think, when you're thinking about using these claims or making these cases. Just to be very clear, this is not in any sense a criticism of anyone who's involved in any of those cases. It's simply saying, from the perspective of someone who has spent 30 years arguing cases at these international courts, be aware of what a possible outcome may be and prepare your client for the woeful consequences of failure.
Well, I was optimistic. Thanks for that, Philippe. No, but they're very, very interesting and subtle points you're making there, which I certainly, as a member of the media, have always failed to appreciate. Janine, very quickly, because I do want to get to questions.
I will wrap up. It's a very good point, and our researchers often come to us and say, but why aren't we going for the crime of genocide? And we constantly say to them, lower the bar, because it is incredibly difficult to prove. But I just want to make one point about accountability and impunity. Every single one of those 400 testimonies that we have in our archive, behind that is a person. It's someone that trusted us to give us their story, and we owe them something. So when we think, okay, is this ever going to get anywhere? We owe it to them to at least try to bring it to some kind of pathway of international justice, because I have been haunted for the past 30 years by all of those women in Focha that I interviewed from the rape camps at Focha. There were 16,000 women raped, sometimes several times a day, with the intention to get pregnant. 24 men went to The Hague. So those women live every day with this sense of justice that was never delivered. We're never going to deliver justice to the 139,000 incidents in Ukraine. It's impossible. But I think messaging is hugely important, and the fact that justice is working, that we haven't, because the 1990s, we were so cynical. There was Srebrenica, there was Rwanda, there was Somalia. There were so many horrible wars. Congo, wars that we're not even talking about. Sierra Leone, Liberia. And people went back to their lives after hideous atrocities had been committed. I mean, most of the crimes in our archive are actually torture. It's not the deportation, it's torture. How do you go back to society? How do you begin to live again after this has happened to you and justice, or some form of justice, is not in motion? So I just, with all the cynicism that we have, or the disbelief that there ever will be any kind of cycle of justice, I just have to say, we have to try. We have to try.
Right, let's open to questions. You caught me in the side of my eye first. Gentleman in the black shirt there. Yeah, maybe. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Khan Ross. Greetings to all of you, and just to take a moment to thank you for all of your extraordinary and important work. I think it's so important, and I'm so glad you're doing it. My question is about this place, the UK. I share your view that we're making progress internationally, albeit conditionally, in the pursuit of accountability. Where we're not making progress is here, in the UK, this country of law. I testified to 2 Iraq inquiries that the government lied about the war and broke international law and avoided alternatives to war. And today we see this government and the previous Tory government supplying weapons to a country that is undoubtedly committing war crimes in Gaza without any fear of true legal accountability. If that is the case, and perhaps Philippe, Ibrahim in particular, but also I'd love your comments, Janine, what can we do? What can we as British citizens do? The lack of accountability is brazen and in your face. Tony Blair speaks at conferences, he's interviewed by the BBC. Alistair Campbell, the perpetrator of the lie, has a popular podcast. He presented Channel 4's election coverage. It's not just legal accountability that is lacking, there's also cultural accountability, the public's accountability, who clearly feel that these people should get away with it. And I don't understand it, and I feel very frustrated about it.
Ibrahim?
I mean, I would just give an example, but Philippe is far more experienced than I am in this. The UK, the former government, set a trend when it came to the recent ICC request for arrest warrant. And they submitted that they said they want to intervene on a question whether Palestine has the right to kind of delegate some on a technicality. It's a technicality that has huge implications. That led to, I don't know how many submissions that the court received, right? So a lot of other countries got excited, and that slowed down the process that we have now. Driving around, listening to Capital music, right? I hear, as breaking news, that the new government has withdrawn what it had said to the ICC and is no longer filing this, right? You've already set a trend, so unfortunately the situation doesn't look very good in terms of the amount of countries that the previous government excited, but that shows that something is working. And that technicality is important, in my opinion. It makes a difference to show the world cares where the UK stands on legal questions. So here just as a small example that pressure does work. You're able to get your voices heard. There are avenues that you're able to kind of push this through. I never dreamt of the day when I was in law school that I'd hear both the ICJ and the ICC on a music channel in the UK. It's happening. It means the public is interested. It means that's something that they think you guys care about when you're voting, when you're writing letters to your MP, and so on. So clearly there is an avenue. How much you can use it is a question that I'll put to Philippe.
So it's already, just a couple of months on, not very fashionable to say nice things about this new government. But actually, they have shifted. They have shifted. And they've shifted in material ways. What you gave as an example of having withdrawn the intervention requesting the judges of the International Criminal Court to cease and desist in the possible issuance of an arrest warrant in relation to any Israeli nationals, because Israel is not a party to the Statute of International Criminal Court, they withdrew it under intense pressure from various quarters. They did it, and they will pay a price over time for doing that. They have also, some would say it's not enough, but they have suspended some arms licenses in relation to certain armaments being sold, and they've got a lot of flack from that for some quarters. Again, many people, perhaps including in this room, would say they didn't go far enough, they should have gone further, they should have done this. But this has not happened before. In relation to other cases in which I'm involved at the International Court of Justice, the United Kingdom has withdrawn, under the new government, submissions made by the previous government. And so there is a change taking place. It may not be enough to please everybody, but it's significant. And I think Ibrahim is absolutely right. That is a consequence of pressure, and that is a consequence of individuals writing to MPs, individuals voting for candidates who are opposed to what is going on over there, and making Labour candidates who are favoured to win and even get cabinet seats lose. And that is a form of accountability. I can't miss the moment also, just to draw to your attention, I can't say very much, but some of you will have read another book I wrote called The Lost Colony, about the removal of the entire population of Chagossians from the former British colony of Mauritius and the subsequently created new colony. For the last 2 years, the previous government, let us give them credit, and this government have been negotiating a resolution of that issue. And I'm not pessimistic about the outcome. Why did that happen? Why did Britain, which severed a part of its former colony of Mauritius and create a new colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory, after 50 years and an ICJ ruling, suddenly change position? Curiously, because of Russia and Ukraine. And you may ask yourself, well, why did they change position in relation to Russia and Ukraine? And the answer is very simple. They went, the British, to African countries and said, please help us end this illegal Russian occupation of Ukraine. And as a significant South African ambassador said to me, "It was really interesting, Philippe. They came to us, they made their pitch, and we said to them, let's see if we've understood this correctly. You want us to help you bring to an end Russia's illegal occupation of Ukraine, whilst at the same time, in the face of a ruling of the International Court of Justice, you persist in your illegal occupation of the Chagos Archipelago, part of Mauritius and Africa." We don't think so. Fuck off. That's what happened. You go to any Security Council debate on Russia-Ukraine, the Russians, the Chinese, and their mates just say, you talk about Russia and Ukraine, Chagos, you're illegally occupying part of Africa. No one here knows about Chagos. It's the point that you make. No one here knows what our own country has done. But I want to give them credit because they are responding to domestic and international pressure, and it's having an impact. And if it pans out that they resolve it, I think they deserve plaudits for doing that, unlike other countries, which thus far have not changed position. So I'm less pessimistic than you, Ross. I mean, you're very well placed, and you know I'm 100% with you on Iraq. But it's not entirely bleak. There are things that are happening which are indeed responsive to public pressure and external international pressure.
Politics trumping principle once again. Pramvira's got the mic. She's in charge.
Sorry, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So my name's Ron. I've had the, I would say, pleasure to work with victims and survivors of atrocity crimes in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere. And I had a question that was actually picking up on what Philippe and Ibrahim was saying on what accountability looks like. And I say accountability and not justice because I think to a certain extent, justice ends once a crime is actually committed. But how do you then, when doing your work, Janine, how do you reconcile with that disagreement on what accountability looks like? And how do you set expectations for victims that are providing those testimonies? And what do you say to them? And how do you translate what accountability looks like to them? Because I believe every victim has an idea of what accountability looks like, but it's not standardized in a way.
Me? So the first thing when we're training our researchers is do not promise anything. And if you've ever worked in a refugee camp or even as journalists when people would come to us and beg us, take my child, get me out of the country, please bring my case to justice, we can't promise anything. We just say, we're taking the testimony, we will make sure it gets in the right hands, but we don't say we're going for the crime of genocide or we're going to bring you to The Hague. And what's interesting is we thought at first when we were devising our template for our questionnaire that most people wouldn't want to talk because they'd be afraid. But it's extraordinary the number of people that do want to talk. And we always say to them as well, and this is the same as when we were journalists, if someone doesn't want to talk to you, you can't force them. And then there's also the issue of trauma, right? You cannot take a testimony from someone who's deeply traumatized. So the immediate aftermath of, say, a rocket attack in Kramatorsk, you have to wait until they're giving you a clear line of thought. So I think the expectations have to really be managed. We have to be really careful when we're working with our, I hate the word victims, survivors. And I think, Ibrahim, we're trying to work now, can I say this, on a project with victims, which I think is hugely important to transitional justice. So I think you can speak to that better than me.
May I come in very briefly?
Quickly as you can, because we want to get some more questions in.
Thank you, Roman, for your question. And I think I also no longer, unfortunately, use the word justice. It's not something that I can use in contexts like, I can use it in patterns like this, but not when I'm working, unfortunately, because I think, the saying goes, you kill, a couple of hundred people might end up in The Hague, you kill 100,000, you end up in a peace conference, right? This is where they invite you then to figure out, what is the punishment? What sort of, and this was, something that Philippe has said, when there's an overpromising of a specific brand, why are we caring about that category of crime? Because if the punishment, if the kind of real concrete outcome is life imprisonment or a death penalty for a war crime or a crime against humanity or genocide. I mean, you can't make it more than that. Why are we then pursuing terms that we might not be able to get? And that's a question of how victims see it. From our perspective, and for me personally, all what I can promise is that I will do my best. I will keep the fight. That's it. When we did it on torture victims and survivors and so on, all what I tell them is that what I can guarantee you is that I will do my best to keep your issue alive, to keep the issue on, if they want to. For others, justice was just ended. I don't want to be remembered. I want to start my new life in Germany or France or wherever I am, and I don't want to be reminded of what's going on. And I think this is where it really matters with each person as to where they are in that sense. And I'll just very briefly, in 2 lines, build on something that Philippe has said in relation to the kind of cases that we have. Because a lot of people were like, the double standards. On Ukraine, you're doing so much, why you're not doing on other things? I hope this doesn't get taken out of context. I like double standards. I think double standards are useful to call out hypocrisy. I hope I don't practice double standards, but I like double standards because it allows us to say, you've done X and Y. It sets the bar high in one case that then allows us to be able to push, well, you've done it there. Why are you not doing it here? If I didn't have countries acting with double standards, you would not be able to call it out. You would not be able to call out hypocrisy that then moves the lower standard to the highest standard that we need. One of the US ambassadors at large, Beth Van Schack, she said, the high water, it raises all the boats with it. And I think that's what we need to. We need to be able to capitalize on double standards and on hypocrisy to actually get them to deliver more on cases, not deliver less on other just causes.
We're going to take
two more questions here.
one after the other.
Thank you for letting me speak today. My great-grandfather fought in the 20s during the First World War in Belgium, and my question to you is how do you think my Jewish religion and Israel feels with the media hate against Israel and the media controlling the Ukraine and the Russia war, and how can the Ukraine win the war with Russia with the media encouraging to carry on fighting? And after meeting Terry Waite and John McCarthy, after hearing their inspiration stories, how you like it you were taken hostage on October the 7th in Israel last year, with Israel trying to help them be released, where the British government isn't willing to release the hostages. Let me finish. And how dare the let me finish. How dare the South African take the Israel to the International Criminal Court when Putin took me in the restaurant for his war crimes against Ukraine?
Yeah, we'll back that up. We'll take them.
Thanks, guys. Piotr from a crisis group. We've chatted on Twitter a couple of times. Appreciate your sensitivity in navigating this. So interjoin question is basically, we've touched upon a lot of examples in the past 30 years, but do you not think it's time for international law to be modernized, right? Ethnic cleansing was a term developed out of the Bosnian situation, but it's not in the Charter. And entwined to that is that at the moment we've got the UNGA, and the US has signalled that they're quite open to the idea of reforming the Security Council, which in the context of peace and security is the arbitrator of a lot of international law. So were we to get a normalisation of African seats and representation, possibly India or Japan, do you think that could make any changes for international law going forward? Thank you.
Let's have the answers in reverse order. I'll deal with the media thing if you want to deal with that last question.
Why don't one of you answer the UNGA?
Security Council, I can take the Security Council one. I mean, I have recently in an event managed to speak to the president of Sierra Leone, who led the charge at the Security Council, the recent charge of the Security Council when Sierra Leone was on it. Quite a historical moment, because Sierra Leone was actually the president of the Security Council in the month of August, and they pushed hard for an African seat, which, as you know, the US kind of agreed to. agreed to the idea of adding African states. I mean, I think the Security Council is, from what we've seen, and my experience in Syria, the flip chart and the flip situation in Palestine, is that we keep getting vetoes the moment we want to access some of the criminal organizations, institutions that we have created. So, for example, again on the radio, when a caller called and saying, is the ICC being anti-Semitic by going after Netanyahu and not Assad, right? And as a Syrian, I pulled over, I called into LBC because I said, I have to comment on this. I didn't get through, you'd have to know. But as I wanted to come through, it was because the Security Council blocked the ICC referral that we had. The ICC does not have jurisdiction because the Security Council, because obviously, first and foremost, Syria does not put itself, the Syrian regime does not allow its, the court to have access. But then the Security Council, when the world tried to refer the matter in 2014, got double vetoed, got Russia and Chinese veto. Today we're getting US vetoes, UK abstentions, and French 4, which is also a quite interesting dynamic as to see how these things matter. So clearly we do have a problem at the Security Council, and clearly there's more space to kind of do some reform. But when I read the fine line as to what the US has agreed to when it comes to Africa, is increasing the permanent seats but not increasing the veto power. Yes. So when you read the articles, just look up exactly what they said, is that we're not increasing the it said, quote, not quote, because there's a very kind of intentional, but close to a quote, we are not, none of the 5 will give up theirs, and adding any more will make it complex. And therefore, we do not support adding that.
Just one last note on the pernicious media. As the only member of the media on this panel, I can tell you I've been standing under a shower of shit for the last 2 weeks from the contributors from both sides in the Israel-Palestine debate, and it is the most thankless, miserable task of any of us have ever faced. And the only indication that we're doing the right thing is that both sides are contributing to that shit shower. Thank you all very, very much for your